New York Times with a story out about the inner workings of the investigation into Donald Trump's campaign, even before it became the Donald Trump administration. There's some interesting tidbits in there. And then, of course, it made Donald Trump angry. That's nothing surprising, but we'll get to his reaction at the end. Apparently, the FBI program was called Crossfire Hurricane. Well, that was prescient because there's been a lot of crossfire and a hurricane of criticism, et cetera. So, well, let's find out, why were they investigating the Trump campaign in the first place? Well, they got word that the Russians were meddling in the election overall. Then they realized, here, let me go to the New York Times to quote this, the FBI investigated 4 unidentified Trump campaign aides in those early months, congressional investigators revealed in February. The 4 men were Michael Flynn, Paul Manafort, Carter Page, and Mr. Papadopoulos, current and former officials said. Each was scrutinized because of his obvious or suspected Russian ties. So, FBI gets information that the Russians might be trying to interfere in an election. Then they find out 4 of the Trump campaign officials have deep ties to the Russians. Manafort made a ton of money basically working for Russian oligarchs and protecting their interest in Ukraine, and he's now under massive investigation over that. Michael Flynn might have been what is technically called an agent of Russia, and he wound up striking a deal with a special prosecutor. So they were right. They were right to investigate these guys. And then that leads us to Carter Page and Papadopoulos. So they explain about Page. Mr. Page, a foreign policy advisor, was well known to the FBI. He had previously been recruited by Russian spies and was suspected of meeting one in Moscow during the campaign. It would have been criminal negligence on the part of the FBI to not investigate that. If any campaign, Hillary Clinton's, Gary Johnson's, anyone's, had people working inside of it that were Russians working with Russian spies and then went to Moscow in the middle of the campaign. Do you have to investigate that? Of course you have to investigate that. So Times explains, relying on FBI information and Mr. Steele's, that's the famous Steele dossier, prosecutors obtained court approval to eavesdrop on Mr. Page, who was no longer with the Trump campaign. So this is part of what the Trump team flips out about. Oh my God, they were looking into our campaign. Well, you've got a guy working with Russian spies in your campaign. What do you want him to do? So they had enough evidence, and they did this the right way, the legal way, to go and actually get court approval to eavesdrop on Carter Page. And at that point, he wasn't even in the campaign anymore. So now let's go to Papadopoulos. Lastly, there was Mr. Papadopoulos, as the Times explains. The young and inexperienced campaign aide whose wine-fueled conversation with the Australian ambassador set off the investigation. Before hacked Democratic emails appeared online, he had seemed to know that Russia had political dirt on Mrs. Clinton. So Papadopoulos is in London. He gets sauced, starts talking to an Australian ambassador, and starts telling him all the information that the Russians have on Hillary Clinton. The ambassador is thinking, puts me in a really difficult situation. I don't know what I'm supposed to do about this. He goes and checks with his government. They go talk to the FBI, and then in a situation that is really rare, that ambassador sits down with the FBI and gives them a formal interview and says, you guys got to watch out. This guy's talking about how the Russians have information and are working to interfere in your campaigns. And that was before it was revealed publicly that the Russians had in fact done that, and they released the emails, the Hillary Clinton emails, the DNC emails, et cetera. So they knew ahead of time. So if you're an investigator at the FBI and an allies ambassador comes and tells you, hey, look, the Russians are going to do this, and then you see it happen, again, it would be gross negligence not to investigate that. That's the whole point of the FBI, is to investigate potential crimes, et cetera, just exactly along these lines. More from the Times. The FBI obtained phone records and other documents using national security letters, a secret type of subpoena, officials said. And at least one government informant met several times with Mr. Page and Mr. Papadopoulos, current and former officials said. Now, this is again where the Trump guys go, oh my God, they had an informant infiltrate our campaign. Now, you wanna know why they did that? Because they didn't wanna make it public before the election that they were investigating the Trump campaign potentially working with the Russians, because that might have damaged Trump's campaign. And they didn't know whether they actually had or not. That's the whole point of an investigation. So they didn't want to prejudge it. So in order to be fair to Donald Trump, they didn't want to go in and say, okay, campaign officials, Papadopoulos or Carter Page, who used to work on the campaign, you're going to come in for questioning at the FBI. That would have made it public. Then they would have had to talk about, yes, the Trump team is under investigation for possibly working with the Russians. And that would have hurt Trump's chances tremendously. In fact, the FBI did him an enormous favor. And that favor actually it is documented here in the New York Times story too, and through sources at the FBI, and wound up hurting Hillary Clinton a ton. Why? Because of the huge dichotomy in how they treated two different campaigns. Hillary Clinton was also being investigated by the FBI at the same time. So now when Trump says, oh, this is like Watergate, I can't believe they were investigating me, but they were also investigating your opponent for a different reason. So can the FBI never investigate anything that any politician ever does? So, but the difference was, in Hillary's case, 2 different times the FBI came out and said, we're investigating her, and she was extremely careless, and she did this, that, and the other thing. And right before the election, they came out, we're reopening the investigation, right? But meanwhile, not a word about Trump, when they also had an investigation about him. As the Times explains, agents feared being seen as withholding information or going too easy on Hillary Clinton. Now, did they have that same fear about Donald Trump? No, they had the opposite fear. And they worried that any overt actions against Mr. Trump's campaign would only reinforce his claims that the election was being rigged against him. That is another case of Republican whining to the refs working brilliantly. And by the way, Mitch McConnell had that information. Congressional leaders, the Obama administration had the information. Watch out, the Russians might be interfering in your election and they might be working with the Trump team. And Mitch McConnell said to Obama, if you dare do that, we'll say that you're meddling in the election and you're interfering, et cetera. And Obama was like, okay, I'm sorry, I won't do it. And they didn't make it public. So they attacked Hillary Clinton publicly, the FBI did, but they did not tell you they were also investigating Donald Trump on what I would argue is a far more serious transgression. So it is so ironic when Trump attacks them. It's the exact opposite of what's true. They went out of their way, and not necessarily because they supported Trump. And some of the FBI officials, we found out through their texts, did not support Trump. They also didn't support Hillary Clinton. And they thought that the Justice Department should have gone harder after Hillary Clinton. You know why? Because they're the FBI, that's their job. But even though they didn't support Trump, they were like, no. Some of them, by the way, others were Republicans who totally supported Trump. But overall, though, the whole FBI was like, no, don't tell anybody publicly because then they'll yell at us. Trump will yell at us and Republicans will yell at us. Democrats yell at us, who cares? Who cares? Just run over Democrats. So if there was any political bias at the FBI, it was definitely against the Democrats in this particular election. So now to be fair to Donald Trump, New York Times explains, a year and a half later, no public evidence has surfaced connecting Mr. Trump's advisors to the hacking or linking Mr. Trump himself to the Russian government's disruptive efforts. So, and this is very important. That's why this investigation has not concluded. We don't know what's going to be at the end of it. They explain, look, the Russians definitely hacked in, according to our intelligence officials, and they got information and they released it. And we know that the Russians reached out to the Trump campaign and that they had a meeting. Donald Trump Jr., Manafort, and Kushner went to that meeting, and the meeting's purpose was for them to get incriminating information about Hillary Clinton. But at the meeting, they did not get that information. So at this point, it's still unclear whether the Trump campaign actually received the information that the Russians had. Now, it didn't really matter much because the Russians released them publicly anyway. To me, what I've said from day one is what is way more important is the potential money laundering involved with Donald Trump and his businesses well before the election and the Russians. So for Donald Trump, a little bit of help from the Russians during the campaign, okay, that's good and that's important, and he publicly called for it, which was outrageous in the middle of the campaign. He said, I hope the Russians release more. more information they might have stolen from his opponent, yeah, that's outrageous, but it's help around the edges. Why Donald Trump might actually care about Russians is if he in fact did money launder, as a lot of publicly available evidence suggests, well then he would want to make sure that there is no investigation that could lead down that path. That's what he's actually worried about. But as far as the election is concerned, the investigation has not concluded, and they do not yet know if the Trump team ever took information from the Russians and hence colluded with the Russians in that regard. Okay, and finally to Trump's tweet about this, he says, wow, word seems to be coming out that the Obama FBI, quote, spied on the Trump campaign with an embedded informant. Andrew McCarthy says there's probably no doubt that they had at least one confidential informant in the campaign. If so, this is bigger than Watergate. But first of all, I don't think you know what Watergate was. In this case, the FBI has evidence, and we now find out overwhelming evidence, which now the Senate Intelligence Committee, led by Republicans, confirms. Yes, they meddled in the election. Yes, they were against Hillary Clinton. And yes, the third point is they were in favor of Donald Trump. What do you want the FBI to do? Not investigate that? And that informant was, the whole point was to keep it quiet so it wouldn't hurt your campaign. And yet Trump goes, oh my God, I can't believe this. They're Watergating me. No, if anything, you're the one doing Watergate. You're the one that potentially did those crimes that they are legitimately investigating. And of course, though, unfortunately, these political attacks do work. In the numbers that I'm obsessed with, he got 61% of Republicans to believe that the FBI is completely lying and totally manufacturing evidence against them, which is outrageous. That's preposterous. And yet, with his propaganda saying it over and over again, now Republicans think, oh yeah, the FBI shouldn't investigate Donald Trump, even if they had evidence that he might have broken the law. No, I bet they made it up. I bet they manufactured the evidence. That's crazy talk. He's gotten the whole Republican Party, if they didn't already lose their mind, to lose it collectively. Two easy ways to follow the Young Turks. One is hit the subscribe button down below, then you're a TYT subscriber. And second is ring the bell. And when you do that on YouTube, you're notified of our videos.